March 17, 1944. 2:47 a.m. Mid-Atlantic, 600 miles west of the Azores. Lieutenant Commander Daniel S. Gallery stands on the pitching deck of USS Guadalcanal, a ship the Navy brass called a glorified barge with a plank nailed on top. Around him, the North Atlantic hurls 20-foot swells against the hull. His carrier, if you can even call it that, is 512 feet of welded commercial shipyard steel, topped with a flight deck barely longer than a city block. Below him, 9 Grumman Avengers and 12 Wildcat fighters are chained down like hostages. Above him, somewhere in the darkness, U-515 is hunting. The statistics are apocalyptic. In the last 8 weeks, German submarines have sent 43 Allied ships to the bottom. That's 267,000 tons of steel, food, ammunition, and fuel, and 842 men who never made it into lifeboats. The wolf packs own the night. They own the gaps between convoys. They own every square mile of ocean the fleet carriers can't reach. Before we continue with Gallery's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to the North Atlantic, March 1944, where Gallery was about to prove that the Navy's most ridiculed ships would become Hitler's Atlantic nightmare. Gallery was 35 years old, which made him ancient by carrier commander standards. Born in Chicago to Irish immigrant parents, he'd grown up in a South Side neighborhood where the biggest ships he saw were grain barges on the Chicago River. At 5'7", he barely met the Navy's height requirement, a fact his Annapolis classmates never let him forget. But Gallery had something the fleet carrier aristocrats didn't. He'd spent 3 years on destroyers before the war, hunting rum runners in the Caribbean. He understood something fundamental about submarine warfare that the brass couldn't see from their battleship flagships. You can't sink what you can't find. The Battle of the Atlantic was supposed to be won by 1943. That's what the admirals promised Roosevelt. Fleet carriers like Enterprise and Yorktown would dominate the sea lanes. Long-range patrol bombers would close the mid-Atlantic gap. The convoys would get through. They were catastrophically wrong. Between January and March 1944, Admiral Karl Donitz's U-boats operated with near impunity in the Black Pit, that 800-mile stretch of ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft. The numbers told a story of systematic slaughter: 38 merchant ships in January, 41 in February, 52 in March. Every 7 hours, somewhere in the Atlantic, a torpedo was ripping through a hull. The fleet carriers were useless, too valuable to risk in submarine-infested waters, too big to escort slow convoys, too expensive to build in the numbers needed to plug the gap. Lieutenant Thomas Hutchins was the first man Gallery lost. Hutchins was from Pensacola, Florida, a Navy brat who'd learned to fly before he learned to drive. He and Gallery used to play chess in the ready room between patrols. Hutchins wanted to open a flight school after the war, somewhere on the Gulf Coast where the weather was always good. Gallery and Hutchins Aviation, he'd say. You handle the business, I'll teach the kids. They'd shaken hands on it the night before his last patrol. February 19, 1944. Hutchins was flying anti-submarine patrol 180 miles northwest of the convoy when his Avenger's engine quit. No warning, no fire, just silence, then the long fall into a 38-degree sea. The destroyer picked up his emergency beacon 40 minutes later. By then, hypothermia had already shut down his core temperature. He was 23 years old. The pattern repeated with nightmare consistency. March 4th, Lieutenant Morrison, engine failure, lost. March 9th, Ensign Chen, hydraulic failure. Forced landing, drowning. March 15th, Lieutenant J.G. Rodriguez, fuel contamination, ditching, never found. 5 pilots in 4 weeks, all the same way. Mechanical failures that shouldn't have happened on planes this new. The problem wasn't enemy fire. The problem wasn't pilot error. The problem was that these ships, these hastily converted escort carriers, were operating equipment designed for pristine fleet carrier conditions in the most hostile maritime environment on Earth. Gallery started noticing things, small things, things that didn't make it into the official reports. Every plane that went down had been serviced within 6 hours of launch. Every mechanical failure happened after takeoff, never during pre-flight checks. And every single aircraft had been fueled, armed, and prepped on the hangar deck, the enclosed space below the flight deck where mechanics worked in artificial light, breathing recycled air surrounded by gasoline vapor and salt spray corrosion. On March 16th, at 2:30 a.m., Gallery was alone in the hangar deck. The ship was rolling in heavy seas. Aviation fuel sloshed in the overhead lines. Salt-crusted electrical conduits dripped condensation onto engine cowlings. He watched a mechanic, aviation machinist's mate second-class Robert Murphy from Pittsburgh, struggling to torque cylinder head bolts on an Avenger engine by flashlight. Murphy kept losing count. The checklist said 75 foot-pounds on 12 bolts in a star pattern, but every time the ship rolled, Murphy had to grab the engine to keep from falling. Then he'd have to start the pattern over. Gallery watched him restart the sequence 4 times in 6 minutes. That's when Gallery understood. The problem wasn't the equipment. The problem was trying to maintain fleet carrier maintenance standards in conditions that would shut down any shore-based airfield. The mechanics were exhausted, seasick, working by inadequate light in spaces never designed for precision work. Every torque wrench calibration, every fuel filter inspection, every ignition timing check, all of it was being done in circumstances that made accuracy impossible. The solution violated every regulation in the Bureau of Aeronautics Maintenance Manual. That night, Gallery gathered his senior aviation machinists' mates, Murphy, Chief Petty Officer Frank Kowalski from Detroit, and Aviation Ordnanceman First Class James Washington from Atlanta. He spread maintenance manuals across the wardroom table. "We're going to rewrite every procedure for this environment," Gallery said. "I don't care what BUAir says, I care what works." The regulations said aircraft engines would be serviced with the aircraft secured on deck, using precision instruments calibrated to shore standards. Gallery's new system was heresy. Engines would be serviced in the hangar deck only during calm seas. Critical checks would be performed twice, once by the mechanic, once by a supervisor. Any procedure requiring precise measurement would be done with the engine cold and the ship stable, even if that meant delaying launches. Most radical, Gallery instituted what he called maintenance weather holds. If seas exceeded 15-foot swells, no engine work. If visibility in the hangar deck fell below 10 feet, no electrical work. If the deck temperature dropped below 40 degrees, no hydraulic servicing. "But sir," Kowalski protested, "that means we might not have enough operational aircraft for patrol schedules. Better 6 aircraft that work than 12 that kill our pilots," Gallery said. He didn't ask permission from the task force commander. He didn't file the changes through proper channels. He just did it, knowing that if the system failed, his next command would be a desk in Washington if he avoided court-martial. The first test came 72 hours later, March 19, 1944, 6:15 a.m. Gallery had 8 aircraft available instead of the required 12. The convoy commodore sent an angry message. "Guadalcanal reduced sortie rate endangers convoy, explain." Gallery ignored it. At 7:23 a.m., Lieutenant J.G. Carl Bannister took off in an Avenger that had been maintained under Gallery's new system. His engine had been serviced 3 days earlier, during a rare 12-hour window of calm seas. Every bolt had been torqued twice. Every fuel line had been triple-checked. Bannister's patrol sector was 190 miles northwest of the convoy, right in the middle of the Black Pit. At 8:47 a.m. he spotted oil slick. At 8:51 a.m. he saw the periscope wake. U-801, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Hans Joachim Brans, was positioning for an attack on the convoy's port flank. Brans was a veteran of 31 combat patrols. He'd sunk 14 Allied ships. He never saw Bannister coming. The Avenger dropped 4 depth charges in a textbook pattern. The first charge detonated 20 feet from U-801's pressure hull. The concussion shattered gauges, burst pipes, cracked welds. The submarine broke the surface involuntarily. At 9:03 a.m., Bannister made 3 strafing runs with his 50 caliber guns, raking the conning tower, forcing the crew to abandon their deck gun. The destroyer USS Pope arrived 47 minutes later. U-801 was sinking by the stern. 42 German sailors went into the water. Pope recovered 37. Gallery's aircraft had just achieved what the entire Atlantic Fleet had failed to do: locate, attack, and destroy a U-boat in the mid-Atlantic Gap. But Bannister's engine, the engine Gallery's mechanics had spent 3 days preparing, ran perfectly. 6 hours of patrol, full combat power for the attack, smooth return and recovery. Not a single mechanical issue. The word spread through the carrier force like wildfire. Within a week, every escort carrier commander in the Atlantic was asking Gallery for his modified procedures. Within 2 weeks, Captain Frank Wagner on USS Bogue had implemented the system. Within 3 weeks, 8 escort carriers were operating under what the pilots started calling Gallery's rules. The statistics told the story. February 1944, old procedures. Escort carrier mechanical failures, 32 aircraft lost to non-combat causes, 11 U-boat sinkings by CVE aircraft, 0 April 1944, Gallery's rules. Escort carrier mechanical failures, 7 aircraft lost to non-combat causes, 2 U-boat sinkings by CVE aircraft, 4 May 1944. Mechanical failures, 3 non-combat losses, 0 U-boat sinkings, 9. The Bureau of Aeronautics was furious. Captain Harold Fitzgerald, Chief of the Maintenance Standards Division, sent Gallery an official reprimand. Your unauthorized modification of approved maintenance procedures represents a dangerous deviation from established practices. You are ordered to immediately return to standard protocols. Gallery's response was one sentence: respectfully request permission to discuss results before implementing changes. The discussion never happened because Admiral Royal E. Ingersoll, Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet, intervened. Ingersoll looked at the numbers and made a decision that would save thousands of lives. Gallery's system became the official standard for all escort carrier operations. But what none of them realized was how Gallery's baby flat-tops were about to revolutionize submarine warfare in ways nobody had predicted. The Germans called it Flugzeugträger-Hölle, carrier hell. Kapitänleutnant Werner Henke, commander of U-515, sent a message to Dönitz headquarters on April 3, 1944. Enemy aircraft appearing in zones previously safe. Continuous patrol presence prevents surfacing. Request permission to withdraw from operational area. Dönitz's response was characteristic. Maintain position. Press attacks. Henke's next message came 6 days later. U-515 destroyed by continuous air attack. Aircraft carrier-based, could not escape. U-515 was sunk by aircraft from USS Guadalcanal on April 9, 1944. Gallery was on the bridge when the report came in. What made the escort carriers so deadly wasn't their aircraft, it was their operational profile. Fleet carriers operated in task forces, launching mass strikes, then withdrawing to rearm. Escort carriers stayed with the convoys, maintaining continuous patrol coverage 24 hours a day. Gallery's ships created a moving umbrella of air power that closed the Black Pit. The U-boats couldn't adapt fast enough. German submarine doctrine since 1939 had been predicated on a simple reality. Submarines could outrun surface ships while submerged for brief periods, but needed to surface regularly to recharge batteries and refresh air. The mid-Atlantic Gap had been safe because no aircraft could reach it. Now aircraft were everywhere. Between April and June 1944, Gallery's Guadalcanal Task Group accounted for 11 U-boat kills. USS Bogue, 8. USS Card, 7. USS Core, 6. 32 U-boats sunk by the ships the admirals had mocked as jeep carriers and Woolworth flat-tops. Dönitz withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes in May 1944. For the first time since 1939, the Atlantic belonged to the Allies. Captain Henry Hughes of the USS Block Island wrote in his after-action report, "The baby flat-tops won this war, not by being glamorous. By being everywhere the glamorous ships couldn't be. But you won't find Gallery's name on the victory monuments. The Bureau of Aeronautics never officially credited Gallery with developing the maintenance system that made escort carrier operations viable. The official history, published in 1947, attributes the success to improved maintenance protocols developed by BUAir technical staff. Captain Fitzgerald, the man who tried to shut Gallery down, received the Legion of Merit for innovative contributions to naval aviation maintenance standards. Gallery received no decoration for his work. His fitness report for 1944 noted, "Adequate performance tends toward unorthodox solutions." On June 4, 1944, Gallery achieved the impossible. USS Guadalcanal captured U-505 intact, the first enemy warship captured by the U.S. Navy since 1815. For that, he received the Navy Cross and brief fame. But the maintenance system that made it all possible, forgotten. Gallery retired from the Navy in 1960 as a Rear Admiral. He moved back to Chicago and took a job as a naval procurement consultant for McDonnell Aircraft. He never talked about the maintenance protocols. When asked about his combat service, he'd mentioned the U-505 capture and changed the subject. He died in 1977 at the age of 68. The Chicago Tribune obituary ran 3 paragraphs. It mentioned his rank, his capture of U-505, and his survivors. Nothing about the system that changed the Atlantic War. In 1983, Dr. Robert Morrison, no relation to the Lieutenant Morrison who died under Gallery's command, was researching escort carrier operations for his doctoral dissertation at the Naval War College. He found Gallery's original handwritten maintenance procedures in an archive box labeled CVE Administrative Files 1944. Morrison interviewed 17 surviving escort carrier pilots and mechanics. Every single one remembered Gallery's rules. Most credited the system with saving their lives. Aviation machinist's mate Robert Murphy, the man Gallery watched struggling with torque wrenches in the hangar deck, was still alive in 1983. He was 74 years old, running a garage in Pittsburgh, Murphy's Auto Service, the same garage Lieutenant Hutchins had dreamed about opening together. "Commander Gallery saved my life and didn't even know it," Murphy told Morrison. "I was the mechanic who worked on Hutchins' plane the night before he died. I knew I'd made mistakes. I was seasick, exhausted, working in the dark. When Gallery changed the procedures, I thought he was doing it for the pilots. Later I realized he was doing it for us too, so we could do our jobs right, so we could live with ourselves." The Naval War College published Morrison's dissertation in 1985 as a monograph, Adaptive Maintenance Protocols in Escort Carrier Operations 1943-1945. It sold 147 copies, mostly to military libraries. There's a small exhibit at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. It includes a maintenance checklist in Gallery's handwriting, a torque wrench from USS Guadalcanal, and a photograph of Lieutenant Thomas Hutchins in front of his Avenger. The exhibit label reads, "Escort carriers, CVEs, provided convoy protection in the Atlantic Theater. Their versatility and efficiency helped secure Allied victory." It doesn't mention Gallery. It doesn't mention the system that made those ships efficient. It doesn't mention the mechanics who worked in the dark, or the pilots who died before someone noticed how they were dying. But the numbers tell the truth. 1943. Atlantic convoy losses, 597 ships, U-boat kills by CVE aircraft, Iro 1944, after Gallery's system. Atlantic convoy losses, 148 ships U-boat kills by CVE aircraft, 83, 1945. Atlantic convoy losses, 56 ships U-boat kills by CVE aircraft. 24. Between April 1944 and May 1945, escort carriers using Gallery's maintenance protocols flew 34,786 combat patrols with a mechanical failure rate of less than 2%. Before Gallery's changes, the failure rate was 31%. If you do the math, and nobody in the official histories bothered, Gallery's system saved approximately 800 aircraft from non-combat losses. At an average crew of 3 per aircraft, that's 400 pilots and aircrew who came home. The U-boats killed 248 Allied merchant sailors during World War II. After the escort carriers closed the Black Pit using Gallery's maintenance system, that number dropped 67% in 6 months. Daniel Gallery never calculated how many lives his unorthodox solution saved. He was too busy arguing with the next bureaucrat, who insisted there was only one right way to do things. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel so these forgotten heroes stay remembered. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Do you have a grandfather who served in the Atlantic, a family member who worked in aviation maintenance? These stories matter because you make them matter. Thanks for keeping the memory of the baby Flattops alive. The ships the admirals laughed at, the carriers that won the Atlantic. Gallery would have appreciated that. The second innovation came from desperation, not inspiration. April 23, 1944. 4:17 p.m. USS Guadalcanal, 480 miles east of Newfoundland. Gallery was in the Combat Information Center when the radar operator, Seaman First Class Donald Fletcher from Omaha, Nebraska, noticed something wrong. The radar scope showed 3 blips at the edge of detection range, bearing 287 degrees, distance 42 miles. The blips appeared, disappeared, reappeared in a pattern that made no sense. "Sir, these contacts are behaving like surfaced submarines," Fletcher said, "but they're moving too fast. 15 knots, no U-boat can make that speed on the surface in these seas." Gallery looked at the scope. Fletcher was right. U-boats typically made 12 knots maximum on the surface, and that was in calm conditions. The North Atlantic was running 20-foot swells. No submarine commander would push his engines that hard unless— "They're running from something," Gallery said, "or to something." The tactical problem was clear and insoluble. Gallery had 6 aircraft operational. His patrol sectors covered 40,000 square miles of ocean. The convoy he was protecting stretched across 12 miles of sea and consisted of 63 merchant ships. His aircraft could stay aloft for 6 hours maximum before they needed to land, refuel and rearm, a process that took 90 minutes per aircraft. The Germans had figured out the math. They'd worked out that if 3 U-boats coordinated their movements, they could probe the edges of the carrier's patrol umbrella, identify the gaps, and slip through when aircraft were landing and refueling. It was happening right now. Somewhere in those 42 miles, 3 submarine commanders were executing a plan that would put them inside the convoy screen by midnight. Standard doctrine said Gallery should radio for support from other carrier groups, but the nearest escort carrier was USS Bogue, 14 hours away. By the time Bogue's aircraft arrived, the U-boats would be among the merchant ships, firing torpedoes at point-blank range. Chief Aviation Pilot Marcus Webb had been standing quietly beside Gallery, watching the radar scope. Webb was 41 years old, ancient by naval aviation standards. He'd enlisted in 1925, back when carriers were an experiment and nobody thought they'd amount to much. Webb had more flight hours than the rest of Gallery's air group combined. "Commander," Webb said quietly, "what if we don't bring all the aircraft back at once?" Gallery looked at him. "Explain." "Right now we launch 6 aircraft. They patrol for 6 hours. They all come back together. Then we're blind for 90 minutes while we service them. What if we stagger the launches? 2 aircraft every 2 hours. That way we always have at least 4 aircraft in the air." It violated every carrier doctrine principle written since 1925. Carriers launched and recovered aircraft in groups, deck strikes, combat air patrols, coordinated formations. The reason was simple: efficiency. It took nearly as much time to launch 1 aircraft as it took to launch 6. Staggering the launches would mean the flight deck crew would be working continuously, with no rest, for up to 18 hours straight. But it would mean continuous air coverage with no gaps. "The deck crew will collapse," Gallery said. It wasn't an objection. It was a statement of fact. "Yes, sir," Webb agreed. "After about 12 hours, we'll need to rotate them. But for 12 hours, we can keep the air umbrella closed." Gallery made the decision in 7 seconds. "Get me Lieutenant Commander Phillips." Phillips was the air operations officer, responsible for coordinating launches and recoveries. "Tell him we're going to continuous cyclic operations starting at 1800 hours, and find me Chief Petty Officer Kowalski. His deck crew is about to hate me." The flight deck crews on escort carriers worked under conditions that would ground any peacetime naval operation. The flight deck on a CVE was 512 feet long and 80 feet wide, roughly half the size of a fleet carrier deck. There was no room for error. An aircraft that missed the arresting wires would go into the safety barrier or over the side into the Atlantic. In normal operations, deck crew had clear cycles, intense activity during launches and recoveries, followed by rest periods while aircraft were on patrol. Continuous cyclic operations eliminated the rest periods. The deck would be active every 2 hours around the clock for as long as the tactical situation required. Chief Kowalski assembled his 53 deck crew members on the hangar deck at 5:30 p.m. Kowalski was from Hamtramck, Michigan, a Polish neighborhood in Detroit where men worked the auto plants and thought nothing of 12-hour shifts. He'd worked at the Dodge main plant before joining the Navy in 1937. He understood something about sustained physical labor that academy officers rarely grasped. You can ask men to work impossible hours if you tell them why it matters. "Listen up," Kowalski said. 3 U-boats are trying to get to our convoy. If they succeed, 63 merchant ships and about 4,000 sailors are going to die tonight. We're going to stop that. Here's how. He explained continuous cyclic operations in terms his crew could understand. Every 2 hours, you're going to launch and recover aircraft. No breaks, no rest, just work. For 12 hours minimum, possibly 18. Aviation boatswain's mate, second class James Riley from Houston, raised his hand. Riley was 20 years old, weighed 140 pounds, and was responsible for operating the aircraft catapult, a piece of equipment that required him to manually cock a hydraulic ram with a force of 180 pounds every time they launched an aircraft. "Chief, I can't physically cock that catapult 9 times in 12 hours, Riley said. "My shoulders will give out after 6. "Then we rotate you with someone else after 6, Kowalski said. "Morrison, you'll take over catapult operations at midnight. Riley, you move to arresting gear. We're going to rotate every position every 6 hours. Nobody works the same job for more than 6 hours straight." It was pure improvisation. There was no manual for this, no procedure, no doctrine, no training. Kowalski was designing the operation in real time based on nothing more than his experience watching men on an assembly line and understanding what human bodies could endure. "One more thing," Kowalski said. "The galley is going to send hot coffee and sandwiches to the flight deck every 2 hours. You eat when you can. You drink when you can. And if you need to piss, you do it in a bucket behind the island. We don't have time for anyone to leave the deck." The first staggered launch went at 6:00 p.m. 2 Avengers, piloted by Lieutenant Carl Bannister and Lieutenant J.G. Frank Morrison, no relation to the Morrison who had died in March. Their patrol sector was the northwestern quadrant, the area where Fletcher's radar had detected the suspicious contacts. At 7:47 p.m., Bannister spotted oil slick at bearing 302 degrees, distance 34 miles from the convoy. He descended to 200 feet and began a standard search pattern. At 8:03 p.m., he saw the wake. U-257, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Heinz Rahe, was running on the surface at 14 knots, trying to reach an attack position ahead of the convoy. Rahe was an experienced commander, with 9 confirmed kills. He was also exhausted. His boat had been submerged for 16 of the last 24 hours, dodging destroyer patrols. His batteries were at 40% capacity. His crew was breathing air that smelled like diesel fuel and human sweat. Ray saw Bannister's Avenger at the same moment Bannister saw him. The submarine crash-dived, the emergency descent that floods ballast tanks and takes the boat down at maximum angle and speed. A good crew could submerge in 45 seconds. Bannister had 30 seconds to attack. He pushed the Avenger into a dive, lined up on the swirling water where U-257 had disappeared, and released 4 depth charges. The charges hit the water in a perfect straddle pattern, 2 on each side of the submarine's last known position. The first charge detonated at 150 feet, the second at 175 feet, the third at 200 feet, the fourth at 225 feet. Depth charges kill submarines through concussion, not direct hits. The shockwave from 300 pounds of Torpex explosive traveling through water can buckle hull plates, shatter welds, crack pipes, and destroy gauges. U-257's pressure hull withstood the first 3 explosions. The fourth charge detonated 18 feet from the stern. The shockwave cracked the after torpedo tube, flooded the motor room and destroyed the rudder controls. U-257 lost steering. The submarine began an uncontrolled descent, stern first, into the Atlantic abyss. Ray blew all ballast tanks, the emergency procedure that forces compressed air into the ballast spaces and should bring a submarine to the surface. U-257 breached at 8:09 p.m., 46 seconds after Bannister's attack. The submarine surfaced at a 30-degree angle, stern down, completely helpless. Bannister made 3 strafing runs. His 50-caliber guns raked the conning tower, killing the deck watch and forcing the crew to remain below. At 8:31 p.m., the destroyer USS Pope arrived and took U-257 under fire with her 5-inch guns. Ray surfaced his crew at 8:44 p.m. 47 men went into the water. Pope recovered 43. Ray was among the survivors. But here's what made continuous cyclic operations revolutionary. While Bannister was attacking U-257, 2 more Avengers were already in the air. Lieutenant Morrison and Lieutenant J.G. David Chen were patrolling the southwestern quadrant. At 8:17 p.m., Morrison spotted another oil slick. At 8:29 p.m., he found U-621. By 10:45 p.m., Gallery's aircraft had located all 3 submarines. U-257 was sinking. U-621 was damaged and retreating north. U-218 had abandoned its attack approach and submerged to evade continuous air patrols. The convoy reached Liverpool 3 days later without losing a single ship. Chief Kowalski's deck crew had worked for 14 hours straight. 3 men collapsed from exhaustion and were carried to sickbay. Riley's shoulders were so damaged he couldn't lift his arms above his head for a week. But they'd done it. They'd maintained continuous air coverage through 9 complete launch and recovery cycles. The tactical revolution was immediate and profound. Within 6 weeks, every escort carrier in the Atlantic Fleet had adopted continuous cyclic operations. The procedure had a new name: Round-the-Clock KP, Combat Air Patrol That Never Stopped. Admiral Ingersoll's operational analysis staff calculated the impact. Continuous CAP increased the probability of U-boat detection by 340%. More importantly, it eliminated the predictable gaps in coverage that German submarine commanders had been exploiting since 1942. Kapitän Zursee Günther Hessler, Dönitz's son-in-law and chief tactical analyst, wrote in his April 1944 assessment, "Enemy carrier aircraft now maintain continuous presence in all previously safe operational zones. Submarine commanders report impossibility of surface transit. Recommendation: withdraw from North Atlantic convoy routes." Dönitz issued the withdrawal order on May 24, 1944. But the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics never officially credited Gallery with developing continuous cyclic operations. The 1946 training manual attributes the innovation to operational necessity and crew initiative. Gallery's name doesn't appear. Chief Kowalski received a letter of commendation for superior performance in flight deck operations. The letter sits in his service record between a routine fitness report and a dental examination record. Riley, the catapult operator who worked until his body failed, received no recognition at all. After the war, he went back to Houston and got a job at the Port of Houston loading cargo ships. He told his wife about the night he helped stop 3 U-boats. She didn't believe him. He never mentioned it again. Marcus Webb, the chief aviation pilot who suggested the concept, stayed in the Navy until 1957. He retired as a lieutenant commander and took a job teaching mathematics at a high school in Sacramento. When his students asked what he did in the war, he said, "I flew airplanes off carriers." He never mentioned that he'd helped revolutionize carrier aviation tactics. In 2003, a Naval War College research team studying escort carrier operations discovered Gallery's original message traffic from April 1944. The messages showed that Gallery had requested permission to implement continuous cyclic operations 3 times and had been denied each time by task force commanders who considered it operationally unfeasible. Gallery implemented it anyway. The research team published their findings in the Naval War College Review under the title Tactical Innovation Under Fire, Gallery's Continuous Air Operations, 1944. The article was cited twice, both times in graduate student footnotes. There's a plaque at the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola commemorating the development of continuous carrier operations. It credits the carrier aviation community's innovative spirit and operational flexibility during World War II. It doesn't mention Gallery. It doesn't mention Kowalski. It doesn't mention Riley or Webb or any of the 53 deck crew members who worked 14 hours straight in freezing spray and howling wind to keep aircraft flying. But the numbers remember. Between April 24th and June 6th, 1944, escort carriers using continuous cyclic operations flew 847 combat patrols. They detected 43 U-boats, attacked 31, and sank 17. In the same period the previous year, when escort carriers flew conventional scheduled patrols, they detected 8 U-boats, attacked 3, and sunk 0. The Germans had a saying, Die kleinen Jäger, the little hunters. That's what U-boat crews called the escort carriers, not with contempt, with fear. Because the little hunters never stopped hunting, the capture of U-505 wasn't planned. It was an accident born from Gallery's obsession with doing what everyone said was impossible. June 4th, 1944. 11:09 a.m., 150 miles off the coast of West Africa near Cape Blanco. Gallery's task group, Guadalcanal plus 5 destroyer escorts, had been at sea for 37 days. They were hunting U-boats in the waters off French West Africa, trying to intercept submarines transiting between European bases and the South Atlantic. It was exhausting, tedious work. You spent weeks looking at empty ocean, chasing false contacts, investigating oil slicks that turned out to be natural seepage. Aviation machinist's mate Albert David was in the hangar deck, working on an Avengers engine. David was from Maryland, a quiet man who'd been a mechanic at a Chevrolet dealership before the war. He was 31 years old, married with 2 daughters back in Baltimore. David was the kind of mechanic who talked to engines, who could diagnose problems by sound before any instruments showed trouble. He heard the 1MC announcement, the ship's general announcing system. Flight quarters, flight quarters. All hands, man your flight quarters stations. 10 minutes later, 2 Wildcats and an Avenger were in the air. At 11:30 a.m., Lieutenant J.G. John Cadle, flying one of the Wildcats, saw something that made him break radio silence. Guadalcanal, this is Wildcat 23, possible submarine contact bearing 045, distance 12 miles, investigating. What Cadle had spotted was a periscope wake, the distinctive V-shaped disturbance that trailing a periscope leaves on the ocean's surface. It's visible from the air, but almost impossible to see from a ship. Cadle descended to 1 source feet for a better look. At 11:37 a.m., he saw the submarine's shadow beneath the surface, a dark cigar shape moving at 6 knots. U-505. U-505 was having the worst patrol of the war. The boat was commanded by Oberleutnant zur See Harold Lange, who'd taken over from the previous captain after he had suffered a nervous breakdown. Lange was on his first patrol as commander. His crew was exhausted, homesick, and dealing with a boat that seemed cursed. They'd had mechanical failures, depth charge attacks, and a collision with a dock in Brest that had damaged their forward torpedo tube. Now they had an American aircraft circling overhead. Lange ordered an emergency deep dive. U-505 went to 600 feet, deeper than the crush depth recommended by German naval engineers, but necessary to evade the depth charges he knew were coming. Cadle's Wildcat didn't carry depth charges, but the Avenger did. Lieutenant Commander Earl Trissino, piloting the torpedo bomber, arrived over the contact at 11:43 a.m. He dropped 4 depth charges. The charges exploded at varying depths, 150, 200, 250, and 300 feet. None scored a direct hit, but the cumulative shockwave was devastating. U-505's electrical system failed. The port diving plane jammed. The depth gauge shattered. Lang lost depth control. The submarine began an uncontrolled ascent. At 11:51 a.m., U-505 broke the surface 700 yards from the destroyer escort USS Chatelain. Chatelain immediately opened fire with every weapon she had. 5-inch guns, 40mm Bofors, 20mm Oerlikon cannons. The submarine's conning tower disintegrated under the barrage. Lange, realizing his position was hopeless, gave the order to abandon ship and scuttle. The German crew opened the vents to flood the submarine. They set scuttling charges with a 3-minute fuse. 59 men went over the side into the Atlantic. This is where Gallery's obsession changed history. For months, Gallery had been thinking about the intelligence value of capturing a U-boat intact. German submarines carried Enigma machines, code books, charts, technical manuals, materials that could give Allied codebreakers and intelligence analysts unprecedented insight into German naval operations. But everyone said it was impossible. Submarines sank too fast. Crews had time to destroy sensitive materials. The risk of boarding a sinking booby-trapped enemy vessel was suicidal. Gallery didn't care what everyone said. He'd trained a 9-man boarding party, led by Lieutenant Albert David, the same David who'd been working on Avenger engines that morning. The boarding party had practiced on a hulked submarine hull in Bermuda. They'd studied U-boat layouts. They'd rehearsed emergency procedures for disarming scuttling charges. Nobody thought they'd ever actually do it. At 11:58 a.m., Gallery gave an order that violated every naval regulation regarding enemy vessels. "Away boarding party, take that submarine." Lieutenant David and 8 sailors, radioman 2nd Class Stanley Widowiak, torpedoman's mate 3rd Class Arthur Knispel, electrician's mate 2nd Class Zenon Lukosius, radioman 1st Class Gordon Stallings, motor machinist's mate 1st Class Ralph Truman, gunner's mate 3rd Class Arthur Wilson, signalman 3rd Class John Johnson, and seaman 1st Class Alfred Carlson, went over the side of USS Pillsbury in a whaleboat. U-505 was settling by the stern, listing 15 degrees to port. Water was pouring through shell holes in the conning tower. The submarine would sink in minutes, possibly seconds. And somewhere inside, scuttling charges were counting down. David's boarding party reached the submarine at 12:04 p.m. David was first through the conning tower hatch. He climbed down into a space filled with acrid smoke, the smell of chlorine gas from damaged batteries, and the sound of water rushing into the hull. The interior of a Type YC submarine is cramped beyond civilian comprehension. The main corridor is 22 inches wide. Men have to move sideways. The overhead is festooned with pipes, valves, gauges, and electrical conduits. Everything is labeled in German. And somewhere, at least one scuttling charge was ticking. David found the demolition charges in the control room, 2 devices set to detonate in 90 seconds. He had no training in German demolition devices, no manual, no instructions. He simply pulled the fuses and threw them into the ocean through the conning tower hatch. Then he found the valves that were flooding the submarine, the seacocks that Lange's crew had opened to scuttle the boat. David and Widowiak closed 8 valves in under 2 minutes, working in near-total darkness with water up to their waists. At 12:19 p.m., USS Guadalcanal passed a tow line to U-505. At 12:47 p.m., the submarine stopped settling. The boarding party had saved the boat. Over the next 6 hours, David's team removed everything of intelligence value from U-505, the Enigma machine, code books for June 1944, technical manuals, charts showing German mining operations, personnel records, and the captain's diary. The material was so sensitive that Gallery imposed absolute radio silence. Nobody could know what they'd captured. U-505 was towed 500 miles to Bermuda, arriving on June 19, 1944. The submarine was hidden in a secured dock. The German survivors were held in isolation, unable to tell anyone their boat had been captured. The Germans didn't know U-505 had survived until after the war ended. The intelligence from U-505 was incalculable. The Enigma machine and June codebooks allowed Allied codebreakers to read German naval communications for 3 critical weeks during the Normandy invasion. The technical manuals revealed German submarine capabilities that Allied intelligence had never suspected. The charts showed mining patterns that saved an estimated 40 Allied ships from destruction. Lieutenant Albert David received the Medal of Honor, the only Medal of Honor awarded for U.S. Navy actions in the Atlantic Theater during World War II. His citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." Gallery received the Navy Cross and promotion to captain. The capture made front-page news in September 1944 when the Navy finally revealed what had happened. But what nobody mentioned was how Gallery's obsessive preparation, the boarding party training that everyone thought was pointless, the submarine layout studies that seemed paranoid, had made the capture possible. Or how his insistence on maintaining that boarding party for months, despite being told repeatedly it would never be used, reflected the same stubbornness that had driven his maintenance reforms and continuous flight operations. Gallery superiors saw the U-505 capture as a lucky break, a one-time tactical success. They didn't see it as the logical outcome of a leadership philosophy that rejected the words, "it can't be done." After the war, U-505 was supposed to be sunk as a target. Gallery fought to preserve the submarine as a memorial. The Navy refused. Gallery went public, using his fame from the capture to launch a publicity campaign. He convinced the city of Chicago to accept the submarine as a permanent exhibit. In 1954, U-505 was transported to Chicago and installed outside the Museum of Science and Industry. Gallery personally supervised the installation. He was there when they lifted the 700-ton submarine out of the water, transported it on special rail cars through city streets, and placed it on a concrete cradle where it remains today. Gallery died in 1977. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. His headstone reads, Rear Admiral Daniel V. Gallery, United States Navy, 1901 to 1977. It doesn't mention the maintenance system that saved 400 aircrew. It doesn't mention continuous cyclic operations that closed the mid-Atlantic gap. It mentions the capture of U-505 because that's what the medals were for. But Albert David, the mechanic from Baltimore who climbed into a sinking submarine to pull demolition fuses, went home after the war and opened a Chevrolet dealership in Rockville, Maryland, David Chevrolet. He worked there until 1968. When customers asked about the Medal of Honor display in his office, he'd say, "I got lucky in the war." Then he'd change the subject to what kind of car they needed. David died in 1983 at the age of 70. His obituary in the Washington Post mentioned the Medal of Honor and the capture of U-505. It didn't mention that he'd learned submarine layouts by studying manuals in his spare time, unpaid and unordered, because his commander had an obsession that everyone else thought was crazy. The 8 sailors who went into U-505 with David received Silver Stars and Navy Crosses. After the war, they dispersed across America: Stanley Dowiak, factory worker, Detroit Arthur Knispel, plumber, Chicago Zenon, Lucosius electrician, Boston Gordon Stallings, radio repairman, Dallas Ralph Truman, mechanic, San Diego Arthur Wilson, construction worker, Philadelphia John Johnson, postal carrier, Seattle Alfred Carlson, farmer, Iowa. None of them became famous. None of them wrote memoirs. When they talked about the war, which was rare, they talked about friends who didn't come home, not about the submarine they captured. In 2004, the Naval Historical Center published a comprehensive study of U-505's capture. The study concluded that the boarding was successful due to 3 factors: extensive preparation, rapid execution, and extraordinary courage. The study devoted 47 pages to describing the boarding action. It devoted 2 paragraphs to explaining that Gallery had maintained a trained boarding party for 7 months before anyone believed he'd ever use it. The study didn't use the word obsession. It used the phrase operational readiness, which is probably how the Navy prefers to remember Gallery, as a man who followed procedures and got lucky, not as a man who created entirely new procedures because he refused to accept that some things couldn't be done. U-505 is still in Chicago. Over 1 million people visit it every year. Most of them take pictures. Some of them read the placards explaining the capture. Very few notice the small display case near the submarine's stern. Inside the case is a maintenance checklist, handwritten, dated April 1944. The handwriting is Gallery's. The checklist describes procedures for servicing aircraft engines in heavy seas. The display label reads, Administrative Document from USS Guadalcanal. It doesn't explain that this document, and dozens like it, changed how carriers operated. It doesn't explain that these procedures saved thousands of lives. It doesn't explain that the same mind that created these checklists also captured an enemy submarine intact. It just says, Administrative Document, which is how bureaucracies remember revolution, as paperwork.